Well, hello. Thank you all for inviting me to join you this afternoon. My name is Dana Weissman. As Ben mentioned, I'm a senior associate at Fehr in our San Francisco office. I have been working on pedestrian safety for nearly 10 years, and I currently lead our firm's multimodal safety practice area. Really excited to be here with all of you, share some of what I've learned about federal safety funding and safety action plans. Before I dive in, I just want to give you a brief introduction to Fehr and Peers. I imagine many of you have never heard of us before. Fehr and Peers is a consulting firm focused entirely on transportation planning and traffic engineering. We have around 330 employees in 19 offices around the country. Our first Texas office opened in Dallas last year with 3 staff. We're really excited to be here, put down roots, and to grow with all of you. We like to say that if transportation planning and traffic engineering is all that we do, we had better be great at it. So we try hard to be. We do this in a few ways. We are truly multimodal. Nearly all of our projects touch on all travel modes. We integrate the latest technologies into our work, including AI and big data. And we also fund our own research and development to stay on the leading edge of what is a rapidly changing transportation industry. A primary focus of our R&D efforts is our discipline groups, which are our core practice areas. We currently have 16 discipline groups. Those are shown up on the slide with staff participation from across the company. And these groups use R&D investments to do things like conduct research, develop tools, lead internal trainings, publish resources, and generally just advance our knowledge and expertise in a specific technical area. So when I introduced myself at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I currently lead our multimodal safety discipline group, which is one of the 16 at Fehr and Peers. And this group of national safety experts supports our offices on all types of safety projects, including the El Paso Vision Zero plan, which happens to be kicking off tomorrow. Very exciting. We're also midway through a Vision Zero benchmarking effort in Denton to help the city identify their strengths and opportunities to advance towards a zero goal, with the next step being a Denton Vision Zero action plan. Much of our safety work is with local jurisdictions, but we do support state safety efforts as well, including advising TxDOT on its pedestrian safety action plan, which is done under our Federal Highway Administration safety focus work. So with that introduction to Fehr and Peers, I'm really excited now to share with all of you some of what I've learned about the new Safe Streets and Roads for All federal grant program, as well as share some insights from my experience supporting jurisdictions with the development of their Vision Zero and other comprehensive safety plans. And so I show here, I have a disclaimer, and that disclaimer is that I do not know nearly as much as you do about Texas-specific grant programs or safety work. I'm going to spend around 20 minutes presenting, and then I'm really looking forward to learning from you as well during our discussion at the end. So I want to start with the recent shift in the federal government's approach to safety. Our current safety reality is rather grim. You can see on the slide 1.25 million lives lost globally every year from traffic crashes. In the United States, we had nearly 43,000 people killed in 2021 alone, and over 7,000 of those were pedestrians. And over the past decade, the number of pedestrians struck and killed in motor vehicle crashes in the United States has increased by more than 50%. So all of this combined makes it very clear that as a nation, we're not making the progress that we need to make on reducing pedestrian traffic deaths, and we really need to rethink how we approach safety. The big question is how. How do we bring the number of traffic deaths down, ideally to zero? And it's clear that what we need is a paradigm shift in how we approach the problem. And that means rather than accepting fatalities and serious injuries as the price we pay for mobility, we need to adopt the mentality that no one should be killed or injured when using the roadway system, and that there's something that we all can do about it. The federal government recently took a step in this direction with the National Roadway Safety Strategy, and this strategy outlines the US DOT's comprehensive approach to reduce deaths and serious injuries to zero on our nation's roadways. And it does this by adopting the safe system approach, which is founded on the principles that humans make mistakes and that human bodies have limited ability to tolerate crash impacts. Some of you may already be very familiar with Safe System. This may be a new concept to others on the call. So I do want to spend just a bit of time on an overview of the approach so that we all have a shared basic understanding. The fundamental objective of the safe system approach is to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries for all road users by accommodating human mistakes and keeping the impacts on the human body at tolerable levels. What separates the safe system approach from the traditional approach to safety is the ethical imperative that not even one death is acceptable in our roadway system. So to make this a bit more concrete, some examples of what it means to accommodate human mistakes might be roadway design features like rumble strips that alert a driver when they're unintentionally departing the roadway, or it may be vehicle design features like autonomous emergency braking, which activate to stop the vehicle when the driver may not be able to do so. Examples of keeping impacts on the human body at tolerable levels might include measures to control speed, physically separating users that travel at different speeds, like drivers and people on bicycles, and vehicle safety features like seatbelts and airbags. It's important to note that the safe system approach is not a new concept. It's existed for more than 30 years in countries across the globe. Early adopters of the safe system approach have seen major decreases in traffic fatalities across their roadway systems. And it's really how they moved off of the plateau of safety to start achieving significant reductions. And it's what we need in the United States. So what is the safe system approach? This graphic developed by the Federal Highway Administration illustrates the key elements. The 6 safe system principles are shown around the outside ring of the graphic, and these are the fundamental beliefs on which the approach is built. They really establish the goals of the safe system approach, they acknowledge human limitations, and they set expectations for how to act. And a successful safe system approach weaves together all 6 principles. So for those of you who can't see on the screen, I'll just read them now. Death and serious injury is unacceptable. Humans make mistakes. Humans are vulnerable. Responsibility is shared. Safety is proactive, and redundancy is crucial. The 5 safe system elements are illustrated in the middle ring of the graphic, and these represent the ways in which the safe system approach is implemented. They address multiple aspects of crash risks, from roadways to speeds, to vehicles, to users, to post-crash care. And the 5 elements reflect a holistic approach with layers of protection and shared responsibility across the entire roadway system. So why does this matter? The safe system approach is the guiding framework for the new federal safety grant program, Safe Streets and Roads for All, and it reflects the federal government's shift towards system-based safety with the ambitious goal of zero. The new Safe Streets and Roads for All program is a great opportunity to help your community invest in meaningful safe system strategies. It's a competitive grant program, part of the new bipartisan infrastructure law, and it's administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. It encourages local, regional, and tribal entities to apply for funding from a new allocation of $5 billion directly supporting safety planning and implementation efforts. And just a note on this slide, mark your calendars, the deadline to apply is September 15th, 2020. Similar to the safe system approach, some of you may already know the ins and outs of this grant program. You may have been participating in all the webinars that USDOT has been hosting recently. And some of you may have never heard of it before today. So I'm going to provide a high-level summary so everyone knows the basics, and I would be happy to answer whatever questions I'm able to during the discussion at the end. The Safe Streets Grant Program is not your typical grant program. It builds on the National Roadway Safety Strategy, which recognizes the need for a different approach and directs attention and funding to address urgent and often overlooked safety needs, including the ones shown here. This includes prioritizing safety of people walking, as well as biking, riding transit, micromobility users. It also prioritizes underserved communities, focuses on unsafe speeds, prioritizes investment in complete streets to serve all road users, and it emphasizes the safe system approach. The grant program funds 2 types of efforts, planning and implementation. Planning grants fund development or completion of a comprehensive safety action plan, or those grants fund supplemental planning that support or enhance an existing action plan. Implementation grants fund infrastructure projects, behavioral programs, or operational activities that are identified in an existing action plan. And to qualify for supplemental planning or implementation, funding, you need to have a qualified comprehensive safety action plan in place. I'll discuss recommendations for developing a comprehensive safety action plan in the next section. We'll spend time there. But for a quick overview, here is a small snapshot of the types of elements that are often included in a comprehensive safety action plan. A high injury network, prioritized project list, buy-in from the community and stakeholders, and a safe system approach. Supplemental planning, which is the other activity funded by a planning grant, can help communities move beyond the basics of an action plan. It provides funding to dive deeper on important safety topics like the examples shown here, covering speed management, accessibility, equity, lighting, engagement, evaluation, and it also could support quick build projects to pilot innovative treatments. And then the last category, back to implementation. Some examples of implementation efforts the grant could fund are listed here. And you'll see that there are some themes. The grant wants you to think big and think bold. The funding minimum for implementation is $5 million. So it also wants you to think system-wide, not just a spot improvement here or there, but really a community-wide set of changes in places that are already problematic and locations that are expected to be problematic because of their design or usage. So let's return for a bit to the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan, since this is the foundation for the grant funding and really the foundation for any community safety program. The Safe Streets Grant Program does require that a Comprehensive Safety Action Plan include the elements listed here. This is how they define a Comprehensive Safety Action Plan. It includes things like robust analysis, prioritized project list, recent completion, and a plan that's publicly available, commitment publicly to a goal of 0, use of a task force, engagement, equity considerations, a benchmarking assessment, and then, of course, evaluation. And these required elements align very closely with the core elements for Vision Zero communities. This is a resource that was created back in 2018, a collaboration among the Vision Zero Network, Institute of Transportation Engineers, and Fehr and peers. And the core elements identifies the critical components of an effective safety program. Some of you may already be familiar with this resource. It's referenced in the Farm and City Texans Guide to Launching Vision Zero, so it may be something you're already using and referencing. There are 10 core elements organized into 3 categories: leadership and commitment, safe roadways and safe speeds, and data-driven approach, transparency, and accountability. And I'm going to highlight a few that I think are particularly relevant for today. Under leadership and commitment, one really important goal to establish at the beginning is your Reach Zero goal and year. And that commitment needs to be supported publicly by elected officials and agency leaders. Some communities really struggle with the idea of committing to a 0 goal because it feels unrealistic. And if this sounds like your community, I encourage you to consider leaning on TxDOT's goal that was established in 2019 to have all traffic deaths and serious injuries on Texas roads by 2035, and then to eliminate them by 2050. And so I think what's important here is that your community doesn't necessarily need to commit on its own. It simply can be consistent with the state's commitment, and that can help make it more palatable. Also, under leadership and commitment, establishing a task force is a really important initial step. You'll want to curate a group of internal and external stakeholders that bring different perspectives, resources, and skills to the effort. Also want to ensure that your task force includes high-ranking leadership, so people who set the agenda and make decisions. Partner this with a broader community engagement strategy that's meaningful and accessible, focused especially on your local equity communities, which we know are often low-income individuals and people of color who are disproportionately affected by traffic violence. Now, under safe roadways and safe speeds, every crash is different, but it's the speed of the vehicle that determines the deadliness of the crash. And that's why it's so critical to set and manage travel speeds to achieve safe conditions for a given roadway context. And speed management can take many forms. There are policies like lowering speed limits to fit the local context. There may be a role for enforcement through automated speed enforcement programs. And importantly, there must be changes to roadway design to encourage or demand reduced vehicle speeds using strategies like road diets and neighborhood traffic calming programs. And for all these speed management strategies, it's valuable to focus first on the high injury network, which I'll talk about in a minute, and roadway context shown to have the deadliest high speeds. Finally, under data-driven approach, transparency and accountability. Standard crash summaries are a really helpful place to start. Building on those, it's important to map your community's fatal and serious injury crash locations to guide priority actions and funding. Often this takes the form of a high injury network. I'm sure many of you have heard of one or have developed one yourselves, derived from quantitative data on hotspot problem locations, as well as qualitative data based on community input. Aligned with the safe system approach, it's also important to apply a proactive systems-based perspective to identify and address top risk factors and mitigate potential crashes and crash severity. So in this case, data are used to identify underlying risk factors that lead to safety challenges, and locations with those risk factors are addressed systemically rather than in response to isolated incidents after they occur. So we talked about funding, we talked about safety plans. How does this come together in practice? So I will wrap up my presentation with an example from Sacramento, California. Between 2016 and 2018, we worked with the city of Sacramento to develop a Vision Zero action plan and a systemic safety analysis report. In those documents, 8 projects were identified as top priority investments for the city based on crash history and crash risk factors. We worked with city staff to prepare project scopes that included project location, improvement types, justification of need, and concept designs. And having this in hand prepared the city really well to submit competitive applications for those 8 projects through the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, construction funding in the next cycle. And the city ultimately won $4.7 million in HSIP funding for 4 of the projects. And right now we're helping the city prepare a Safe Streets and Roads for All implementation grant application to secure funding for their additional priority projects. Once you've identified priority safety projects in your comprehensive safety action plan and you're ready to apply for grant funding, just want to leave you with these factors to consider, kind of tips for a successful grant application. First and foremost, start early. Identify what projects may be competitive well in advance of the grant cycle based on what you know of the scoring criteria. Develop those projects with input from stakeholders and also potentially the community, and then iterate to arrive at what could be the best possible project for the grant. Important to craft a coherent narrative for the grant, something that's really easy to follow, supported by maps and graphics, and something that really conveys the importance and the necessity of your project for your community. And related to the narrative, understand what the grant's evaluation criteria are and address those explicitly in the narrative. Don't be afraid to kind of duplicate text or plagiarize straight from the evaluation criteria themselves to make sure that you're addressing them directly. Incorporate concrete data and analysis into your narrative and application. Always stronger to have data to back up your points rather than to just leave it to conjecture and estimation. Use resources, plan documents, letters of support, anything that you can find to illustrate that your project has political and community support. Make sure that your application emphasizes the feasibility and also the readiness of your project so that the funders know that their funds are going to good use. And then finally, because this happens, it happens to all of us, if your application is not successful, don't be shy, request feedback and try again in the next cycle or through a different grant program. So that concludes my presentation. I want to open it up for discussion. I also have 2 Fehr and Peers colleagues here with me, Josh Peterman and Matthew Ridgway, both from our Dallas office. And any of us are happy to answer questions. We're also looking forward to learning from all of you through the discussion.
Thank you, Dana, so much. We appreciate that. What an excellent presentation. So we have plenty of time, and so in terms of how we'll conduct the question and answers, folks can go ahead and enter their questions in the chat window, or they can go ahead and raise their hand and let us know that they want to go ahead and speak. So as of right now, we don't have any questions. I think Michelle Canton might have one question to kind of get us going.
Hey, Dana, I do. So all this money coming down and the grant cycle, that was kind of my question. So if if we put together a grant this cycle, what does the next cycle look like? I mean, is it going? I wasn't sure for how many years this funding was going to go.
Yeah, great question. This was actually confusing to me, and so when I first learned about the program, and I followed up with USDOT's kind of chat us if you have a question, folks. So the program includes $5 billion in funding. The first call for applications, for grant applications, is right now, deadline September 15th, and they plan to allocate $1 billion in funding through this initial call for applications. They don't have a time frame for when the subsequent calls will be, but I imagine they'll do additional kind of $1 billion increments in coming years. So potentially there are 4 other opportunities to take advantage of this grant opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah, this new
That
grant.
makes sense. And then you also mentioned the high injury network. So leveraging existing TxDOT data and possibly existing Council of Governments data to identify those places where the needs are. Is that what I was hearing?
Yeah, a high injury network is a great tool for identifying high need locations. I imagine there are people on this call who have developed a high injury network for their local community. So I would love to hear people, if anyone wants to speak to or even share an example of what you've developed. I'll just say it at a high level. Typically, it takes the form of identifying, or the ultimate outcome is a map that shows the corridors or potentially even intersection locations that have the highest concentration of fatal and serious injury collisions in a community. It could be all collisions. Sometimes communities focus on bike and ped collisions specifically. They have different high injury networks for each mode. And like you said, the intention is really to help focus a city's investments in particular geographic areas that are shown to have the highest concentration of kind of severe safety impacts. Yeah, I would love to see some examples from Texas if anyone wants to show one.
And I think we definitely have some folks in the meeting who could share in the meantime, while those individuals are gathering their courage. We do have a question from Shalene Walker in the chat. The keys to success slide seem to concentrate on implementation. Our entity has to produce an action plan under planning. And so she's asking, I assume we don't need the amount of data you referred to for a planning grant, because they're hoping to start gather the data during the planning process.
Yeah, that's a great point. There was actually just this morning, in the 2 hours before we started this call, a how to apply webinar that FHWA hosted, and it was specifically focused on how to apply for an action plan grant. Those webinars are recorded, the slides are available online. So if anyone on this call is planning to apply for an action plan grant, I encourage you to watch the recording from this morning. It really just step-by-step how to apply for an action plan or supplemental planning grant. But you're absolutely right. The application for a planning grant is actually quite simple. It's very short, a very short narrative, just kind of three simple stats that FHWA is requiring about your history of crashes. And I think they're really hoping to allocate a lot of money across a lot of different jurisdictions to facilitate the action plan development. Online, there's also a template that you can use under the resources that's not the application itself, but it's a template for the application, and it allows you to just fill out the entire application basically outside of SAMDOT, the kind of government website where the application needs to be uploaded. So you can go through the process now just to see where your gaps are and what you know and what might you need to kind of focus on in the coming months in order to submit that application.
Wonderful, thank you. And for those curious, Michelle did post the link to the webinar in the chat. So please go ahead and take a look at that. So In terms of the action plans that I know that we have in Texas, the city of Austin developed one about 3 years ago. And I don't see anybody from the city of Austin who's involved with that on the webinar today. I know the North Central Texas County of Governments developed an action plan for safety action plan for Dallas-Fort Worth pedestrian safety action plan. Is anybody from NCTCOG on the webinar today? Doesn't seem like anyone is. I don't want to speak for either of those two organizations, but or agencies rather, but I can tell you we've heard quite a bit from the folks from Austin and some from the folks from NCTCOG, and the process of developing those action plans were extremely helpful for those groups. And so obviously they are now going to play directly into the ability to access funding. And to follow up on Shalene's point, she says, thank you. She asked, what role does NCTCOG play in the Denton area planning grant? So NCTCOG being the COG in the region, are you folks aware of what role they'll play for Denton, which is within the NCTCOG region?
Looks like
I can
Josh.
maybe field that one. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Josh from Dallas. I'll tell you my understanding of what the COG is doing, but I don't want to put words in their mouth. The last that I heard is that they're planning to put forward an implementation grant, not for the region. I think it's for one of their already identified high injury network corridors. Denton specifically, what we're doing with them is a benchmarking process that doesn't involve a lot of data collection. It's a self-funded sort of precursor to benchmark their policymakers, their sort of data processes against the 10 core elements of Vision Zero, so they can see if they're prepared to conduct their own action plan. And at the moment, there isn't a plan by the city to actually pursue it, and it has everything to do with timing. So if you're applying for this grant in September, you'll probably be notified as to whether you were granted or not sometime in February, March, and then the funds come, and every city has a different policy as to whether they can use their own money and then backfill it with federal money and that sort of thing. So because of the timing, I think they're gonna fund their own action planning process, but then go back to the well in 23 for an implementation grant.
It's a good question about the role of a council of governments or an MPO. And one thing that the staff from FHWA and USDOT have conveyed is how valuable joint applications are. And they like seeing collaboration across multiple jurisdictions. And so a council of governments can, in my mind, play a couple of really important roles. One is to facilitate that coordination, so to help different jurisdictions get together to combine for a single grant application, or to apply themselves and for funds to develop a region-wide comprehensive safety action plan that would then include all of the kind of jurisdictions within them and allow those jurisdictions to be eligible for implementation funding in a subsequent call for applications. So I think a really valuable role for regional agencies to play as part of this grant program.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll follow up. So Scott White mentioned that El Paso, to his knowledge, is currently in the process of creating an action plan, and that local advocates are trying to get the county and the MPO to get on board with the process, not only to expand the possible scope of the plan, but to make it region-wide, which could benefit the various smaller towns and cities in the region who may not have the capacity to go ahead and develop those on their own. Yeah. And in addition, Nathaniel George from the city of Denton noted that given the very specific expectations of the 10-point safety plan that is required to apply for implementation grants, he anticipates many applications will not be eligible to apply for implementation during this first round. So speaking as a local government representative from the city of Denton, it feels like they may find themselves in an increasingly competitive environment during future calls when everybody has a plan that qualifies for implementation funding. And so he's curious a little bit about your broader perspectives on this component from areas across the United States.
Yeah, I would agree. Now's the time to get in there when you can. One thing that we've been talking to potential grant applicants about is that consider whether you have a plan either that's been developed in the past 5 years or currently in the works that gets you close to all of the required elements, but not quite there, and whether there's some low effort enhancements that can be made or kind of slight tweaks to your scope that can be made now that will allow your plan to be eligible come September. Because I know it's only a few months away, but there are a few months. You know, you can frame it that way to accomplish maybe some small things that can be done to help you meet those requirements. And that's exactly what we're doing for right now some jurisdictions in California where we're currently working on safety plans for them. And when the NOFO came out and the required elements of a safety plan were made clear, we quickly spoke to those jurisdictions and agencies and said, okay, we think that we can pivot slightly and get these elements incorporated in time for the application. So I would say if that feels feasible, that's definitely a good approach to allow you to apply for kind of the next level of funding, because I absolutely agree there are going to be a lot of communities securing funding for action plans, developing those comprehensive safety action plans, and then being ready to compete for implementation in future rounds. So as much as you can do now probably benefits you in competitiveness. The only other thing that I'll add about competitiveness is there's an interesting element that no more than 15% of the overall fund, so no more than 15% of the 1 billion can go towards applicants in a single state. So you're kind of, you're competing against everyone nationwide, but also competing, largely against those in your state. So you might hit that cap based on your state size.
That's excellent insight. Thank you. So it doesn't look like we have any other questions. We can take a couple minutes to see if any come in. I don't see anybody raising their hand. So it looks like we have one. Kathy, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is a little bit random, but I was on the webinar earlier today, and one of the things they mentioned kind of in conjunction with the underserved communities and community engagement was a community benefit agreement, and I did not get the chance to ask what that was, so I thought maybe you guys would know.
I'm curious if anyone else locally has done one of those in Texas and could share about the experience.
No, well, I will send the technical question in to the webinar people and see what they say. I just thought I'd ask while I had the chance. Thank you.
So Shalene did ask what the estimate, what your estimate of the planning dollars are. And it looks like we did get one response from someone, I believe, Joaquin Rodriguez in El Paso, saying we are spending $700K in El Paso. And then Shalene mentioned that based on Texas, per the $150,000 cap and 40% planning cap. I'm sorry, Shalene, do you want to clarify that point?
Yeah, I said K because I'm an English major and not math, whatever it is. Okay, so the way I understand, hi, I'm Shalene Walker. I work for Travis County. We have been following this opportunity for the last couple of months, and Kathy Stevens, who just weighed in, is an amazing person we're all trying to keep up. We understand that 150 million is the most that a state can receive in FY22 for both planning and implementation. And that up to 40% of that can go to planning, or maybe 40% has to go to planning. That is a question. And then if you do the math, which I'm relying on somebody else who did the math, that's like $60 million maybe for planning. So thank you, City of El Paso, for letting us know what your estimate is for your planning process, because that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. But when you look at that, and the people who are going to be able, the jurisdictions, not the people, the jurisdictions who might be able to get in on this right now, as we just heard, maybe Denton has already decided they just don't have the bandwidth to make this deadline. And it's a short deadline. 60 million goes a long ways. Is that your interpretation? And that we should try to create the most comprehensive action plan that we possibly can, given our resources to provide a local match, right?
One response to what you noted, yes, 15%, 150 million. I don't know if the 40-60 split is by state or if it's just overall. So I suppose it's possible that 150 million in California will cover X number of implementation projects, while 150 million in Texas will cover significantly more planning efforts or action plan development. But yes, my understanding is that like they're trying to fund, I mean, they're probably trying to get as many comprehensive safety action plans done as possible with this funding. So as long as your community meets, which is really a very low benchmark for qualifying for the action plan funding, I just find it hard to believe that any community that applies in this first round won't receive the funding needed to develop that action plan. Just like, as you're saying, Shalene, just like the sheer amount of money available, and maybe the lower effort required for an action plan. But again, it depends on how many applicants they get and how competitive it is, and whether people feel they have the resources, like you said, to kind of put to this in this effort in the first round.
Thank you for the clarification. I really appreciate it. We're trying to tell our commissioners court what the current state of affairs is. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a consistent message that we're hearing from a lot of the agencies who are just dealing with a lot of new funding mechanisms that are coming down, and it's kind of like drinking from the fire hose right now. So we have a couple other questions. Fatima Wajahat asked, are the only projects identified in an existing action plan eligible for funding for the implementation grant? And how detailed does the project description have to be in the existing action plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I'm on the other side of those webinars that I've been watching. I'm glad I've had a chance to absorb as much as I can. Yes, the project does need to be included in an existing action plan. So they want it to feed directly from an action plan into funding for implementation. And the level of detail is actually, there is no expectation for level of detail. Like what I'm envisioning is a community decides they want to go, they have a comprehensive safety action plan that meets all the requirements. They have a prioritized list of projects and they decide they want to apply for one of those projects, because each jurisdiction is only allowed to apply for one grant. It can be just a line item in a table. Like it could say, Main Street from A Street to B Street, pedestrian safety improvements. And then that can then be taken, and you can apply for implementation grant funding just with that line item in a table alone. And your implementation grant funding can fund the entire process of taking it from a line item in an action plan table all the way through construction. So planning, design, construction. That's what the implementation funding can fund. And the implementation funding, they're expecting to distribute for each applicant a minimum, although they reinforce there is no official minimum, funding minimum for the applications, but they're anticipating that implementation grants will be at least $5 million. And that's a really big sum, especially for smaller communities. And I think that that's related to their emphasis on joint applications to kind of pool resources to complete more comprehensive system-wide projects. But I think it also speaks to the fact that you can fund a lot of stuff. You can kind of jam a lot of things into your implementation grant allocation, not just the construction, which may not be 5 million, but everything combined can add up to that amount.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So we have a couple questions. I'm going to ask one, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nathaniel and let him ask. But I just wanted to let everyone know that I do see your questions and comments, and I will get to them. And thank you so much for providing those. So we did get one. Matthew Ridgway did mention that if Google is to be relied upon, which is always kind of up for debate, a community benefits agreement is a tool to encourage funds to be directed to small, local, and minority businesses, which would make sense given the increased emphasis on equity and the implications of such in our funding mechanisms. So thank you, Matthew. Charlie Watts asked, what is the consultant's thought on the length of the safety action planning process from their experience with Vision Zero plans? Is it feasible to think an entity would be able to go for the implementation grant the following year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, I just want to say we don't actually know when the next call for applications will come in. So it's possible that there will be another call next year, but it's also possible that it'll be every 2 years or every 3 years, like we've seen some other federal grant cycles, like HSIP. So, but let's assume that it's next year, the kind of the soonest it can be. And I would say, well, if you think about the schedule for developing a Vision Zero plan, 1 year is absolutely feasible to develop one. What's, I guess, becomes a little bit challenging is if the call for projects happens now in September, you apply, you find out you've been awarded the funds at the end of this year, like Josh was saying, or maybe early next. By the time you get your contract into place and the funds get distributed, you're bumping up on potentially the next cycle next year. So, and you cannot start the work until the funds from the grant cannot reimburse you for money spent previously. The work needs to be done directly kind of with the funds flowing through from the grant. So you can't really start the work until you're actually receiving the funding from the grant program. So I think it's less how long does a Vision Zero plan take to prepare and more just like the administrative side of the allocation of funding from this grant program that would probably make it infeasible to secure action plan funding this year and then apply for implementation funding next year. But if the cycles are spaced further apart, probably even just 2 years instead of 1 year, I would say you would be in good shape, or it would be feasible to go from action plan this year to implementation the next cycle. But yeah, I don't really know. It kind of depends.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's a fair way to kind of manage the unknown right now with things changing so quickly. So I'm going to have Nathaniel ask his question, and then really quickly, Josh Peterman did provide a quick clarification on Denton. They have the bandwidth to do an application, but don't necessarily want to wait until 2023 to actually start the planning process. And so Nathaniel can go ahead and provide us with some more context there.
Thanks, Ben. So Nathan George here. Welcome to the city of Denton. So just to, I guess, expound a little bit on what Josh was sharing, the main reason that we have decided that we're going to self-fund and deliver this Vision Zero plan is that we had already started the process prior to my arrival at the city and several years ago, kind of before COVID even, that we were going to develop an action plan. And it was just a decision that at the time that this NOFO came out, we can't wait until the awardees are notified to then start work on a plan and wait potentially 12 months or so to even get started on a plan. So, we found ourselves in a unique position from a schedule perspective that we really just couldn't wait for a grant-funded opportunity to help develop our plan. We had to actually take those actions and start developing the plan. We're very confident that we'll be able to quickly develop a plan and be ready when the next call is out. I think the one other highlight that I would give is that the timing that it takes, as was mentioned, we're working on a baselining assessment, and then we're going to start developing our action plan. And the time that it takes for us to prepare a scope for those services and select a team to do that work is another consideration that each local government has to account for, because it's not an immediate decision that goes through political appointed and elected folks to get that process underway. So that's additional time that has to be accounted for, and that's been a point of contention or just a point of clarification even with our leadership, to make sure everybody understands, yes, we understand that's part of the overall time frame to also get a consultant on board and have them performing those services. So we look forward to getting our plan adopted. We're really excited to be working with Fehr and peers, and they're doing great work for us in the baseline assessment period. So, but I certainly encourage everybody around the state to take advantage of the opportunity, no matter how you fund your plan. Just for us, I wanted to highlight some of those factors that influenced how we're moving forward. And thanks for the minute of your time.
Thank you, Nathan. We appreciate that context. That's extremely helpful, and we're excited for you folks. So we'll go over to Lauren Grove in Houston. Lauren mentioned that Houston will be applying for the implementation portion of this grant using their 2020 Vision Zero Action Plan and High Injury Network as a guide to determine and prioritize streets to submit for projects. In terms of the community support piece, how in-depth does that need to be? For example, do we need to have targeted engagement on each of the projects we submit, or will general support of implementing our action plan be enough?
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. And I pulled up the conditions included in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, that are kind of the conditions required of an action plan to then qualify for implementation funding. And so there's one item in there related to engagement. And the question is, did the action plan development include all of the following activities? So one is engagement with the public and relevant stakeholders, including private sector and community groups. The second is incorporation of information received from the engagement and collaboration into the plan. And third, coordination that included inter and intra-governmental cooperation and collaboration as appropriate. So I said all of that just to kind of pull directly from the NOFO. And so my understanding, my read is that it's more about the action plan development, not the specific project itself. So does your action plan qualify by meeting these requirements? Was there a robust engagement process to develop the action plan? And then whatever projects were identified through the action plan then can be pulled out for implementation funding. I will just note that there's also funding available for they call it supplemental planning. I mentioned that during the presentation. And supplemental planning can fund additional engagement efforts, and those can be in support of a specific project. So I think that if you're going for implementation funding, that can also include supplemental engagement in support of the project that you plan to move forward for implementation. So again, the implementation funding is really all encompassing, like a lot can be captured within that, including, here's a hot tip, include in your implementation grant the update of your comprehensive safety action plan, because by doing that, you're funding the update of the plan that will then need to be used for future implementation funding. And so you can, if the grant is kind of like self-perpetuating, where again, you can use the implementation funding to update your action plan so that it's then eligible for future rounds of implementation funding. But yeah, I hope that helps answer the question from Houston.
Yes, thanks so much. We appreciate that. Joaquin Rodriguez, looks like you raised your hand, and Shalene gave a big thumbs up to that answer. So it sounds like from her perspective, it helped out quite a bit. Joaquin?
Hey, Dana, I just had a quick question. You mentioned that supplemental planning work. So we're kind of in the same position as Denton. We actually just kicked off our Vision Zero action plan earlier this week. And, there are some limitations to what we were able to afford, right? So there's only a certain number of interventions that we're looking at doing conceptual planning for within that action plan. Do you think that we would have a chance of getting funding for supplemental work, even though our existing plan isn't complete, to maybe add on, creating concept interventions for more than the 10 intersections that we're currently planned for?
Yeah, what you're suggesting is a great use of supplemental planning funds. I think, unfortunately, in order to qualify for supplemental planning, you do need to be able to self-certify that you have an existing action plan in place that meets all of the requirements. Without that as kind of the foundation, you then aren't eligible to apply for supplemental planning or implementation funding.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But it would be a great use of those funds, what you're describing, for another round, or if you can move quickly enough. Although I think 3 months might be a little fast for, we asked about a year. Yes, 3 months might be pretty quick for a Vision Zero action plan.
Joaquin, did you have another question? Your hand still raised. I didn't know if you had raised it again.
No, just old hand. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. Thank you. So we have one other comment from Scott White, and I can read it. But Scott, if you're there, I was going to invite you to unmute and perhaps provide the comment. You always have so much good information. We'd love to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. You're muted right now, Scott.
Okay, I hit it and apparently hit it twice in the moment. Wonderful teams, all these wonderful things. I've been doing the same thing you all have been doing and going to every webinar I can to try and learn as much as I can, because every time we do that, we get a little bit more information. And we're actually hoping to take not only our guide that Dana mentioned earlier from Farm and City out on the road next year to get more people involved in this process, but we also are hopefully going to be going around in preparation for the second NOFO, trying to get people to do just what we're talking about right now, getting involved in all this. And so a lot of what is happening that I'm seeing the feds are talking about is not each municipality do things on their own, but they want everybody to do things collaboratively. And that means all the small towns that used to be excluded from some projects like this, they now get a shot at this if they work together, especially if they collaborate with the county or a major municipality or even the MPO. And that way, it's even possible for the whole region to then benefit because they have one comprehensive plan versus 12 different plans. So every time you go to a different jurisdiction, those interventions change and what you can and can't do. So it provides consistency across the board. And the feds are also saying, don't focus on projects, focus on a comprehensive action plan with lots of options in it. So Joaquin is here in El Paso with me, and I'm hoping he's going to take the advice you just gave and my advice and put as much into that action plan. So Dana, please push him from your side to put as much in that plan as possible, because it gives us so much more flexibility. And then based on everything I'm hearing from the feds, they're saying they want not just projects, they want interventions across the board that really address systemic issues and inequities. So where you've got maybe sidewalk networks that are incomplete, instead of trying to list each hole in the network, you can go through and fix all the sidewalks by doing something like that. And so take advantage of this. This is no longer the piecemeal approach that so many of you are used to in the past, you can do wonders now.
Yeah.
And so I hope
Thank
that
you,
I hope
Scott.
that's really what the
Appreciate
feds
that.
are talking about.
Yeah. I think just to build on what
Yeah.
Scott was saying, he gave the example of like sidewalk widening or sidewalk replacement or even installation in places where it doesn't exist. I think the important connection that you'll need to draw is the connection between a lack of sidewalks or insufficient sidewalk infrastructure and safety outcomes. So if you can show that your community or group of communities has a history of crashes involving maybe pedestrians on roadways where sidewalks are inadequate or sidewalks are missing, then that's a really compelling case for a systemic or system-wide application of sidewalk enhancement countermeasure, because you're tying it directly to a risk factor, a crash risk that you're seeing in your community. And that, I think, speaks to the proactive nature of this kind of safety intervention work to address locations that have a high risk of crashes where crashes haven't necessarily happened, but because of the roadway infrastructure or the land use kind of profile in that area, or whatever it may be, the way the roadways are used, they're very primed for crashes, even though they might not have happened yet. So I know many of you know about proactive systemic safety planning, but for those of you who don't, just want to hammer it home.
Yeah, and that's hugely important, something that folks on this coalition talk about extensively. So we want to focus on leading as opposed to lagging indicators. So with that, that's our time. I first of all just want to say thank you so much, Dana, for your time today, your expertise, and all the work that Fehr and peers are doing. We appreciate it. Two very quick notes before I let everyone go. For those on the call from TxDOT, the traffic safety specialists, we do have a meeting tomorrow. So please, if you have a chance, attend that. That's at, I believe, 2 o'clock tomorrow. We'll send out a reminder, but we're hoping to see you all there. And then finally, many of you have hopefully seen that we've sent out the invite for our pedestrian forum. The annual pedestrian forum is being held on August 18th in Austin. We are in person. The event is free. We include lunch and coffee and a little continental breakfast and snacks. So at least just come for the food. We have an excellent agenda that we are building, and we are still in the process of rounding that out. We'll send out at least the first iterative agenda soon. But for those of you on the call who we will be poking and asking to present, please email us back, answer our calls. But we are excited to get all together in August and to see each other, to spend some time visiting, but most importantly, talk about just everything that's been accomplished over the past year and really over the past several years. As I think that we can all say, from when we started the pedestrian coalition 5 years ago, things have changed dramatically in terms of how the federal government, the state government, and local governments are approaching pedestrian safety. We've really seen a significant change in the emphasis and effort being put into protecting our vulnerable road users. So to thank all of you folks for all the hard work that you do. We'll see you at our next coalition meeting, and of course in person in August. And Dana, again, thank you and your team for presenting today.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful.
Good luck.
Well,
I hope you guys win some money.
Thanks. I'll take care.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye.